Welcome! Many channels on YouTube just tell you one side of the weather story. They'll tell you all about the cold weather that's happening here or there, the record snowfalls and things like that, and try to build this up into some sort of conspiracy theory that we're heading into a grand solar minimum and a little ice age. What I do each week is go around the news services and look for interesting weather events and try to give you a perspective on all the sorts of events that are going on. And this video summarizes the results of that research. There have been several reports recently of the polar vortex collapsing. Well, first, what is the polar vortex? It is a set of winds circulating around the polar regions that tend to contain the cold Arctic air at high latitudes. As this weakens, some of that cold air can flow further south from the polar regions, and ironically sometimes it allows warmer air to flow up to the pole, so you can have the North Pole being much warmer than areas further south. The net effect on our weather is that you get bursts of very cold weather punctuated by bursts of very warm weather. So it makes the temperature much more variable than it was before. Are the bushfires in Australia unprecedented, as some claim? Australia's bushfires this year are the third worst on record, and by the end of the year could quite easily become the second worst. But they are fundamentally different from previous record years. The previous records were set following large amounts of rainfall that produced a great deal of grass and bush that subsequently dried out and caught fire. The bushfires were allowed to burn in remote areas without interruption. The recent fires followed a severe drought and are mainly in wooded areas. So this is a different type of fire and is caused mainly by drought. Unfortunately, Australia may well be looking forward to more examples of these types of fires in the future if the climate does not change. We had a late season tropical storm form in the Atlantic. It was called Sebastian. With winds of nearly 65 miles per hour, it's very close to becoming a hurricane. And if it does, it's going to be a very rare event. Only 7 hurricanes have formed in the Atlantic after November 20th since 1965. The current track of this tropical storm is heading towards the UK, so you should keep an eye on this weather system to see what it eventually does. There have been floods in Somalia. As many as 400,000 people have been evacuated to higher ground, and it is feared that many may still be trapped in their homes. There are at least 22 dead, and there is the possibility that because of these floods, a famine will follow. Venice is flooded yet again. 3 times in the last week, over 5 feet of water has inundated the city. St. Mark's Square has been closed to tourists. This flooding is the result of unusually high tides and heavy rains. If bushfires were not enough, some parts of Australia are now suffering from regular dust storms. A place called Medora is suffering at least 2 or 3 of these a week. The fear is that this is destroying the topsoil in the local farms. If you don't think the weather is getting crazy, then you should go to Alaska. In Anchorage, they set a new high temperature early one morning, then set a new record snowfall, all in the same day. Some places are getting heavy rain while others are getting heavy snow. 6 were killed in the Himalayan avalanche when it hit an Indian army base. Further west, Austria was suffering similar sorts of problems, but it was getting not only flooding but mudslides and avalanches. 1 person was killed by a huge mudslide and many have been injured. Influenza is on the march in the Northern Hemisphere. This is a map of influenza outbreaks in the United States. Interestingly enough, you notice that it's the southern states that are getting most affected. These are the warmest states. You often associate influenza with cold weather, but here it seems to be that the warmest states are getting the worst effects. Many people in California are without power yet again. This is the driest start to the rainy season in California for 60 years. That's producing a high fire danger, and the utility companies are having to schedule rolling blackouts to minimize the fire danger. Florida seems to be having its unfair share of algae blooms. It had a severe outbreak last year, and it's happening again along Florida's west coast. Fish and sea turtles are lying dead on the beach, and it can make you sick if you eat any of the contaminated seafood. There was a 50-car pileup on I-25 in Denver this week. Freezing temperatures, snow and mist seem to contribute to the accident. Fortunately, there were no life-threatening injuries. Have you noticed a new pattern with the weather? Long dry periods followed by torrential rains? Well, this seems to be the case in East Africa, and particularly in Kenya, where severe drought conditions were the problem a few months ago. Now is being followed by heavy rains that cause flooding and mudslides. At least 17 people have been killed in mudslides in a place called Takmal. The total death toll could be in the hundreds. Each week, I like to compare the number of high temperature records to the number of low temperature records set during that week. Now, normally, the high temperature records have had the advantage, although this week, the low temperature records have outshone the highs. We've had, for daily records, 143 new record highs compared with 183 record lows. Monthly records, which are much more difficult to set, it's 2 to the highs and 4 to the lows. All-time records, none have been set in either category. However, year to date, the highs still have it, 88,000 to 52,000. So that's all I have for this week. Until next week, goodbye.